Sorry for the delay. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We were just having some technical difficulties, but we're back. We're just going to give it a few minutes. I'm waiting for our speaker to just get on. Today is another incredible iTOOsday where we will be following last week's insightful session where we unpacked product recall. We thought that a part 2 would be necessary considering the feedback that we had received last week, and diving deeper into this topic will also be extremely beneficial, as last week we really only tapped into a part of product liability. So today we will be tapping into it a lot deeper. We are going to be joined once again by a true expert, Jean Nordier. Jean will be uncorking a new layer of complexity. This will occur as we explore product liability, specifically in the wine industry. This is a sector where chemistry meets craftsmanship, branding meets bold expectations. Wine, I'm sure, isn't just a beverage to most of you, and I'm sure a lot of you on this call today are extremely passionate about this as well. When we think about wine, we're not just thinking about the drink, we think about quality, experience, and reputation. This is a whole bunch of promises that wine really holds. But what do we do when these promises fall short? Well, today is exactly what we will be navigating. We'll be looking through the landscape of product liability. We'll be diving into aspects such as inefficacy, guarantees, and touching again on recall. We'll also be looking at real-world claim examples that arises when things go wrong. This can be seen from fermentation flaws all the way to mislabeled bottles. Alongside Sean, we also have one of our claim specialists, Marlon Daniels, who will also be joining us today to share some claim expertise. So we're just going to wait a few more minutes just for Jean to log on, and then we will not waste any more time and start. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. In the meantime, could everyone please just sign the QR code? Could we also ask everyone to put any of their questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to it at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay, test. Will you mute that slide? Okay. Hello, everyone. Okay, looks like we're online. Thank you. Thanks, John.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this very interesting topic that we will be discussing this morning. Apologies for the gremlins. Technology for you. As my kids always refer to me as technologically retarded, I'm so glad that I'm in good hands of the iTOO technical team. The topic for this morning, uncorking risk, navigating the bouquet of product liability coverage. You will recall, for those that attended the presentation last week, that we focused on recall and what it comprises of, what the nuances are, the pitfalls. There was a request from the audience that we perhaps concentrate on the full bouquet of what product liability actually entails, and with specific reference to my choice, as wine has a obviously very important part of my makeup, in the sense that I not only enjoy wine and red wine in particular, but the investigation of product liability claims that involve wine, as you will from the slides and our discussion this morning also learn. I think it gives us a fantastic backdrop to our discussion this morning. So let's get into it immediately. Well, then how do I focus? Go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you very much. All right, understanding product liability in winemaking. The central idea. Winemaking, as you will note from the slide, goes back to 6,000 years before Christ. It's an amazing industry. It has grown. We will not this morning delve into all the intricacies as you would see in this timeline, but the advancements in technology does not for a second mean that winemakers today still make use of the old winemaking methods. In fact, very little has changed insofar as the maturation process is concerned. How is wine made? I've given you a brief indication of how red wine in particular is made. I'll just touch on some of these topics for those interested. Of course, you've got the harvesting of your grape stock. It then proceeds to destemming and crushing. Thirdly, it goes into stainless steel tanks where you have the fermentation process takes place. Fourthly, pressing as a mean to get all the necessities out of your grape stock, and also as a mean to, as a first stage, get rid of some of your let's call it contaminants or items that you would not necessarily want to find in your bottle of wine. Then a very interesting process, number 5, the malolactic fermentation process, where the magic starts happening, where you have your yeast being activated for a second time, or secondary fermentation takes place, as the technical gurus refer to it. And then the very important role of the winemakers during stage 6. You have blending, and it's not necessarily just blending of wine or 2 types or 3 or 4 up to 6 types of red wine being blended, but you also have other additives being added to wine to give it that fantastic taste that you get to know from your favorite wines. The wine, depending on the variety, is then in stage 7 subjected to maturation in oak casks, or alternatively for wines that you would want to drink within a year or 2 from production, in stainless steel tanks. And then number 8, a very important step in this whole process, namely the fining and filtering processes, during which process you would want to remove not only some of the debris that may have made its way through this entire process, but also you remove some of the yeasts that may potentially spoil your wine after it had been bottled. And then the last stage, the bottling of this precious liquid that we all enjoy from time to time. during the bottling process, of course, we deal with a number of different types of the byproducts, including the bottle. As you may or may not be aware, even the color of the bottle makes a big difference to the presentation of a bottle of wine. So it differs from typically a dark green. You may even have an amber that is sometimes used for especially your late harvest type wines to give it that special appearance as well. All right, so having just discussed the winemaking process in a little bit of detail, let's then move to the more serious topic of this morning's discussion, because as we all are aware, it is seldom as simple as just crushing a couple of grapes. Consideration should be given by the winemaker, the cellar master, and the administrative staff of a wine producing farm of a couple of factors. The first one that I would like to mention this morning is the question whether the winemaker wants to make use of a alternatively a fully automated production process. Of course, it adds to the cost of producing wines, and a very critical consideration indeed. Then, as I've alluded to earlier, the types of filtration. There is a cost factor involved, and it also entails a number of different processes. As I've indicated on the slide, you've got gravity-fed filtration, or possibly as an alternative, pressurized filtration. Some of the pressurized filtration options available to winemakers would be cross-flow filtration, you've got plate and frame filtration, lenticular filtration, and cartridge filtration. It's not necessarily important to know the differences between these types of filtration, other than the fact that typically and optimally, a winemaker would want to have absolute filtration of his or her wine in order to remove potentially all of your harmful bacteria that may ultimately result in spoilage. So depending on one's budget, the flagship filtration method would be the absolute filtration. And with absolute filtration, we refer to a system where there's a membrane and wine is pushed through this membrane at a certain micron level to basically filter all impurities out of your wine. If, as an example, you find yourself in a position where you enjoy a bottle of red wine and you see there's some sedimentation collecting at the bottom of this bottle, it doesn't necessarily mean that it includes impurities. It's more a question of the type of filtration used. Some connoisseurs obviously prefer that there is this bit of sedimentation in the bottom of a bottle to give it a bit of that characteristic flavors and aromas that they would want to enjoy. Then, of course, the question of own or contracted in processes. Now, as you may or may not know, in some instances, your winemakers, wine farms do not have the required capital to have a full-on bottling process and the required equipment to do the filtration, alternatively, and or the bottling of its wine on their premises. So they may make use of contracted in services of, for instance, mobile bottling units, where you have a vehicle arriving on a scheduled day or two, and wine stored in the stainless steel tanks would then be relayed into the mobile bottling unit, and there would be filtration of sorts, and then, of course, the filling of bottles, and if opted, also the labeling of the bottles at the same time. So that is a service that is rendered, and it is picking up popularity due to the fact that it gives winemakers the ability to concentrate on producing high quality wine without making use of capital required for the actual bottling and filtration as well. All right, stepping on to the next slide. Other considerations is whether or not your client as a winemaker will use the wine produced for its own use, or alternatively to produce wine on behalf of a client. This is also picking up a lot of speed in South Africa, where the know-how of a winemaker is used to produce wines for third-party customers. It could be a one-stop shop where grape stock is supplied by the insured. Alternatively, it's bought in from other farms, blending occurs, and the entire process of winemaking is then the responsibility of the insured. The customer or client may make use of third-party bottling services and labeling services, but that may also occur on the insured's premises. And then, of course, the maturation at the insured's premises within their facilities, and it may become quite a lucrative spin-off due to the fact that the insured may have invested in a large capital layout over the years that gives them this ability to render the service to customers. Then, as we've seen in the last couple of years, the option of producing organic wines, which entails an entirely different process insofar as the production of grapes is concerned. For instance, the use of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and bactericides would then be limited in accordance with the specification agreed to with the relevant customer. Then, of course, the use of sulfur oxide on harvested grapes to act as a fungicide and possibly also control the development of mold is another key consideration if a winemaker wants to go the organic, inverted commas, route of winemaking. The addition of fining agents to remove impurities is another key consideration, because it entails during the fining and the filtration process the addition of fining agents, which is something that needs to be disclosed to the end users, because there may be an allergic reaction to some of these fining agents used. So a key consideration there as well. Right, moving on to the next slide. As I've mentioned earlier, the consideration of labeling a bottle of wine produced for one's own use or that of a third-party customer is a key consideration insofar as there is a contract entered into between the third party and the insured. And of course, this gives rise to potential liability on the part of the insured for producing wine contrary to the specification. And it's something that needs to be considered in quite a bit of detail if your client renders this service. So it's not only one's own product that is a jeopardy of spoilage if something goes wrong, but of course third-party stock as well. And that gives rise to totally different types of liability on the part of the insured. All right, then the main attraction, so to speak, of this morning's discussion, the types of product liability claims that may arise from winemaking. I have decided to break it down in smaller, manageable pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. The types of liability claims that arise from winemaking should be considered along the lines of the consequences of wine so to speak. And I have listed them in this slide as to your left top corner injury, then moving clockwise damage, then failure to meet the specification and economic loss arising therefrom, moving downwards to about 5 o'clock, a request for product recall, then 7 o'clock, request for product repair or replacement, and then more or less 8 o'clock, a request for a credit, or differently put, the replacement of a bottle of wine. So let's have a look at each of these. If there is the potential of injury or damage caused by wine, that would attract a specific type of liability claim. In other words, if the ingestion of wine gives rise to injury, as you would see somebody being attended to in hospital, for instance, as a result of the ingestion of wine that contains a jar of glass, argument's sake, or worst case scenario, drinking wine that contains a bacteria that then gives rise to somebody falling ill, one would need to effect specific liability cover for such eventuality. Alternatively, as we've seen in a recent case where the bottom portion of a bottle fractures for no apparent reason, and argument's sake, the content of red wine spills onto a very expensive Persian rug and gives rise to third-party damage to property, that would also, of course, require specific type of cover. Now, let's see under what section of the policy these two scenarios would typically fall for consideration. So if we look at the typical cover provided under the public liability section of a policy, and excuse the crayons that I've used, but I think you'll see in a second why that was necessary to render this almost a coloring book. The insuring clause under section 1 of, and in this case, an I2 policy wording reads as follows: we will indemnify you in accordance with the indemnity agreement for claims first made against you during the period of insurance for your legal liability for damages and claimants' costs and expenses for and arising from A, bodily injury suffered by a third party, and B, property damage suffered by a third party. Now, up until this point, I think we'll all agree that, referring to the section in brown, that this is typically a claims made policy. It requires a claim being made against the insured, as you would see in blue. It's a further requirement, if we refer to the section in yellow, that it needs to be a claim made against the insured during the period of insurance. So obviously the current policy period. Very importantly, in orange, for your legal liability. And as we know, legal liability arises from a couple of sources, the most prevalent being contract and delict. And then in pink, for damages and claimants' costs and expenses, which sets out the nature of the cover provided. So damages, tongue-in-cheek, is not the plural of damage, but rather a damages action instituted against an insured. It would also include not only the capital claimed under the damages amount, but also a third-party claimant's legal costs and investigation expenses. And then in green, for and arising out of, so obviously as a consequence of bodily injury suffered by a third party, as we've seen this gent in the hospital, and then also property damage suffered by a third party, as we've seen the red wine spilled on the expensive rug. But I must, at this point, draw your attention to the fact that in terms of the public liability section of the policy, it specifically excludes claims arising out of or in connection with the nature or condition of any product. And for this reason, I think we'll all agree that the two scenarios that I've sketched, i.e. the person in the hospital bed and the damage to the expensive rug, would fall outside of the ambit of Section 1 public liability. The exception, of course, as I've put it there in grayish color, is food and drink provided for consumption on your premises. The reason why there is this clawback is, of course, the fact that the food and drink provided to staff had not yet left the insured's premises. So it may have been a company function and staff falling ill after ingesting food or drink provided by the employer. We'll touch on that in a second or two when we get to the definition of product. All right, as an alternative, let's have a look at Section 2, product liability and defective workmanship. It has to be specifically stated in the schedule. In other words, it is something that needs to be specifically requested during the needs analysis shared with the liability underwriting team at iTOO in order to activate or to apply. I'm going to again read the insuring clause, and it states as follows. We will indemnify you in accordance with the indemnity agreement for claims first made against you during the period of insurance for your legal liability for damages and claimant's costs and expenses for and arising out of or from product liability, bodily injury or property damage suffered by a third party caused by the nature or condition of your product. Now, you will identify a bit of a change in the wording. I've again used my crayons to color in a couple of important sections of the insuring clause. We've dealt with the majority insofar as the claims made basis of the policy is concerned. It still requires a claim being made against your insured during the period of insurance, of course, and also the same requirements of legal liability that needs to arise. But the only difference in this case, of course, is that it arises from product liability. And in this case, it deals specifically with bodily injury or property damage suffered by a third party, in purple right at the bottom, caused by the nature or condition of your product. So if we then move on to a couple of important definitions, it is clear that the intention of the policy is to cover the insured against bodily injury that may arise from the ingestion of this product supplied. And the definition, according to the iTOO policy, is death, physical injury, illness or disease, loss of amenities, emotional distress, or invasion of the right to one's privacy. So a little bit wider than the definition that we historically encountered, where only death and physical injury, or possibly also illness or disease, was covered. So if any of these terms or permutations of bodily injury materialize, it will fall for consideration in terms of the policy, with a proviso, of course, that it stems from the nature or condition of a product. Then turning to property damage, it means physical damage to or loss of or destruction of property, interference with servitude or other infringement of real rights. The term property is also defined in the policy to mean tangible property. In other words, it does not mean information, including electronically stored information, nor intellectual property, nor intangible property rights of any kind. So the definition makes it very clear under what circumstances the bodily injury or property damage will fall for consideration. Very importantly, the definition of product means tangible property, including packaging, containers, labeling, and instructions and advice provided in connection therewith after having left your custody or control. Now, it's a very important point to bear in mind that a product will only be considered for purposes of the cover provided under the products liability section of the policy if the product had in fact left the insured's custody or control. In other words, it must have been handed over for introduction into the market or supplied to a third party. In other words, the insured has no longer have any control or custody of its product. It then also makes it clear that it's not only applicable to products that have been manufactured by the insured or produced by the insured, but referring to any product that has been designed, specified, formulated, manufactured. I've used my brown crayon there to indicate that in the event that we are dealing with a winemaker or a company that produces wine, that it would fall under either formulated or manufactured in this particular instance, or referring to B, a product that was sold, supplied, or distributed, which means that the cover would also apply to retailers or wholesalers, for instance, that actually acquire bottles of wine from a winemaker, which is then sold on or supplied or even distributed into the market. It also includes in C, erected, repaired, serviced, altered, treated, or installed. So you'll gather from this definition that the ambit of the policy is rather wide insofar as what is considered to be a product in this particular instance. So anything designed, specified, formulated, manufactured, sold, supplied, distributed, erected, repaired, serviced, altered, treated, or installed. And of course, the requirement ultimately would be that these services were rendered by the insured or on its behalf in the course of its, I usually use the word declared business, because of course it is something that you need to declare to your liability insurer. All right, looking briefly at exclusions that may typically apply under the products liability section. The policy states, we will not indemnify you under the section against liability directly or indirectly caused by, resulting from, in connection with, or arising from the failure of a product or any part thereof to fulfill the purpose for which it was intended or to perform as specified, warranted, or guaranteed. But this exclusion, very importantly, does not apply to consequent bodily injury or property damage. It goes without saying that if the non-fulfillment of the purpose for which the product was intended gives rise to bodily injury or property damage, it will, of course, fall right into the ambit of what the cover under Section 2 products liability covers. Another exclusion that we see quite often, we will not indemnify you under the section against liability directly or indirectly caused by, resulting from, in connection with, or arising from the cost of recalling, removing, repairing, replacing, reinstating, or the reduction in value of any product if such liability arises from any defect therein or the harmful nature or unsuitability thereof. The reason for this exclusion, of course, is that there is alternative cover that one can effect insofar as the resultant loss suffered by the insured is concerned. So not necessarily covered under the products liability section, but this type of cover can be bolted on to your existing product liability cover. And we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. All right, having dealt with injury or damage, we now deal with a failure to meet a specification and economic loss stemming from such failure. It happens quite often that we are confronted with scenarios where we cannot find any evidence of injury or damage caused by a defective product. The question, of course, arises, well, would such a claim fall for consideration in terms of any other potential extension to the product's liability cover provided by a policy? And the answer is yes. Product inefficacy is something that is definitely a must when dealing with the manufacturing and or production and or altering or any work undertaken to a product is concerned. I'm going to again refer you to the insuring clause. And again, I've hauled out my crayons to help us understand the different phrases in this particular insuring clause. So it reads as follows. We will indemnify you in accordance with the indemnity agreement for claims first made against you during the period of insurance for your legal liability arising from any third party alleging that they've suffered economic loss by reason of property, and very importantly, other than your products being rendered of less value, rendered incapable of full commercial benefit, alleged other than by you to be due to the failure of your products to perform as specified, warranted, or guaranteed, and or to fulfill their intended function. And we agree that we will not raise as a defense to granting indemnity by this policy in respect of this specific section that no loss of property or property damage has occurred. Admittedly, a mouthful. Perhaps if we can break it down in a couple of smaller pieces, we can work through the cover intended. So as you will see in this slide, and I think the best way to explain inefficacy cover is a scenario where we are confronted with a set of circumstances where there is no evidence of physical damage or no injury suffered by a member of the public ingesting wine. However, as a result of the insured's product being used, argument's sake, in a scenario where it is blended with a third-party product, that this product is now considered to be of an inferior quality, still saleable, but unable to achieve the economic value that the third-party claimant intended, then we are typically dealing with an inefficacy claim. So just to go back to the requirements that needs to be met, and I've highlighted that in green for you, by reason of property other than the insured's product being rendered of less value or incapable of reaching its full commercial benefit, then the insurer will, in a case like that, not argue that the absence of damage or injury prevents the policy from indemnifying the insured for the third-party claim arising as a result of such circumstances. Quite a mouthful. We find it quite often in the feed industry as well, perhaps as another example that's not necessarily relating to winemaking, but one that we come across quite often in the broiler bird environment, where our insured, for instance, supplies animal feed, and after ingesting the animal feed, the broiler birds do not achieve the intended weight. So instead of reaching, for instance, a weight of 1.8 kilograms for this particular bird or chicken, it only reaches 1.6 or 1.4 kilograms. And that difference between the intended weight or the expected weight and the actual weight, of argument's sake 400 grams, would give rise to an economic loss to the third-party customer, and if there is proof that the inferior feed gave rise to this difference in the weight, that would typically constitute an inefficacy claim. All right, I hope everybody understands the difference there. All right, moving on, the next aspect would be a request for product recall. We dealt with this specific type of claim in our previous discussion last week, so I won't spend too much time on this particular topic, but just to confirm, in terms of section 16 of the I2 policy, the cover provided is as follows. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary contained in section 2, Product Liability, specific exclusion D, I just want to interrupt myself there. You will recall that that entails the exclusion of recall guarantee, etc. The policy will now indemnify you, being the insured, in accordance with the indemnity agreement, against loss in excess of the deductible, but not exceeding the indemnity limit stated in the schedule, resulting from an insured event that first takes place during the period of insurance. I've highlighted in blue and yellow the important aspects. Right, as we've said in our previous session, an insured event means any product recall resulting directly from a defect. And just to touch on it very briefly, a product recall means the withdrawal or recall of the insured's products from the stream of commerce because of a known or suspected defect. The most important bit, of course, being provided that such insured products were first introduced into the stream of commerce. In other words, it must have left the insured's custody or control after the inception of the period of insurance to prevent cover being affected, of course, once it becomes known that there is in fact a defect and is no longer in your physical possession. In other words, this product must have left the insured's warehouses or storerooms. Last time round, we didn't have time to delve into what product recall costs mean. I have used my orange crayon to indicate to us what the costs that would typically be covered by this section of the policy, and the most important bits would be reasonable and necessary costs incurred by you or your distributor to withdraw or destroy the affected insured product pursuant to an insured event. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. Basically, media costs. In other words, for you to basically make it known to the public that there is a problem with one of your products and that you need to recall one or more of these. Transportation and accommodation costs, cost of hiring additional persons. In other words, the cost that you would not ordinarily incur as part of your normal payroll, overtime being a good example. Expenses in renting or hiring additional warehouses to store product recalled from commerce, the cost of shipping the insured's product from any purchaser. In other words, products that need to be recalled from where they are stored at your customer's premises for on sale to the public. Those costs would be incurred. Then, of course, the expenses incurred in disposing of these defective products. And lastly, the actual cost of disposal of the insured's products. In other words, if they need to be incinerated responsibly, the costs and getting the certification, etc. From my own images, a couple of examples of product that were returned from commerce. They come in different shapes and forms. I had the awesome task of going through some of the products that had already left the retailers' shelves into refrigerators. As you can see in the top left-hand corner and at the bottom corner as well, a product that had, in some instances, already been ingested and subsequently been returned to the retailers for a refund. Then the more palatable items still being in its original packaging in the center, and then the bottom right-hand corner, product that has now been transferred into the back of a vehicle ready for dispatch to where it will be disposed of responsibly. All right, defect, I think we dealt with in our previous discussion, that you are more than welcome to consider in your own time. And then also, of course, the definition of loss means that it's not just the cost of recalling product from the market, but also the cost of consultants and advisor costs that you would typically encounter and incur in a recall action. All right, and then the last two potential permutations of what may happen in the event of the distribution and sale of a defective product: a request for credit by your customers or a request for product repair and replacement. This cover is typically provided by the products guarantee section, and the insuring clause reads as follows: we will indemnify you in accordance with the indemnity agreement for claims first made against you during the period of insurance, for your legal liability for damages and claimant's costs and expenses, for the removal, repair, alteration, treatment, and very importantly, or replacement of any product which is due or alleged to be due to the defective or harmful nature of any product or part thereof, or which fails to perform the function for which it was manufactured, sold, supplied, installed, repaired, altered, or treated by you or on your behalf. As you would have noted, the important bit I've again put in green. It entails cover for the removal, repair, alteration, treatment, or replacement of any product that fails to comply with the specification. Looking at the slide, it gives us a good indication of what would typically be covered in terms of the product guarantee section. Different to all of the other sections that you may want to consider effecting on behalf of your clients, product guarantee deals with the actual product supplied by your insured. So if the bottle of wine is found to be defective, but it can be rectified by virtue of putting it through filters, alternatively adding additional acid to arrive at the correct VA or volatile acidity level, then the costs of attending to such repairs would be typically covered in terms of the product guarantee section. Specific exclusions applicable to product guarantee claims would be the cost in recalling any product. I think it goes without saying that these type of costs would be better or more suitably covered under the recall section. Then also the possession, consumption, use or handling of any product or article or part thereof whilst contained within the premises permanently occupied by you. So unfortunately, any stock that has not been sold on into the market would fall outside of the ambit of the guarantee section. Again, logically, bodily injury or property damage, because that would be covered typically under the product liability section, as we've discussed earlier, and then any consequential losses that may have been suffered. As I've indicated in the previous slide, it deals with the insured's product in essence. All right. We've arrived at the end of this presentation. It's a pity that we've only got an hour at our disposal. There is so much to delve into. If there are any specific questions that you would want to address at this stage, then please feel welcome to do so. I know that Marlon has come up with a couple of questions, topical questions that they as claim specialists encounter quite often. Over to Marlon.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for that. That is a very interesting and insightful. Let's uncork a few questions to help spot where things can go wrong before the wine does. I just have two questions for you. In terms of product inefficacy, what in your view is a guideline the broker should explain to the insured as to what amount over cover will be adequate? Thank you very much for that detailed answer, Jean. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our interesting discussion. I have many more questions, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. For the audience, please post your questions in the chat, and we will prepare an answer sheet and distribute this in due course. Thank you for your time today. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.